Welcome to this talk. My name is Peter Meyer. In the following, my colleague Yixin and I will be presenting our investigation into individuals' awareness, perception, and responses to data breaches that affected them. A data breach is an event in which private, sensitive, or confidential personal information is leaked to unauthorized third parties. For affected individuals, exposed data can cause tangible harms when it's misused for identity theft or account hijacking. And even if these events have not occurred yet, individuals may experience emotional harms as they feel vulnerable or anxious about exposed data being misused in the future. The number of data breaches occurring over time shows us that data breaches are on the rise. In the United States, there were more than 1,000 breaches each year since 2016, leading to more than 1 billion exposed records overall. However, a survey from Ponemon Institute suggests that the most common reaction to a breach notification, stated by 32% of their respondents, was to ignore it and do nothing. This intrigued us, and we wanted to have a closer look at this with a methodology that was different from what had been done before. Prior work primarily asked participants about past experiences with breaches in general, or asked them to describe intended reactions in hypothetical scenarios. Instead, we probe participants with real-world breaches that are known to have exposed their personal information. Therefore, our survey has a greatly increased ecological validity as participants were more likely to relate to these breaches. This also mitigates recall bias, as many participants first learned about breaches in our study and provided immediate responses. To achieve this new methodology, we built our own survey platform that queries the API of Have I Been Pwned, a web service that allows visitors to enter their email address and see a list of known data breaches tied to that email address. We then used the queried data to probe participants about the specific breaches their email address was a part of. Thereby, our study was guided by 5 main research questions, covering factors that influenced the likelihood of an email address's exposure to data breaches, participants' perception of causes and impacts, their awareness of data breaches, their emotional reactions, and their behavioral responses. In our survey, we started by asking participants to provide their most commonly used email address for querying the Have I Been Pwned API, followed by questions about several properties of the email address, such as its frequency and purpose of use. For participants who were affected, we presented up to 3 specific breaches. For each breach, we collected if they were aware of it before our study, their perception of causes and impacts of being affected, their emotional reactions, and if they've done or intend to do anything in response. In the end, we showed participants the complete list of known breaches that included their email address to ensure that they're aware of all risks. Additionally, we provided resources to help participants in taking action and dealing with the potential aftermath of data breaches. So, what did we find? For our first research question, we investigated the factors that influence an email address's likelihood of exposure to data breaches, and we found that many participants were affected. Specifically, 73% of participants appeared in 1 or more breaches, with an average of 5.4 breaches per participant. Regarding the leaked data types, email addresses of course appeared in all breaches since we used the Have I Been Pwned data. Other commonly leaked data types in our sample of 189 unique breaches included passwords, usernames, IP addresses, and names. We then ran a quasi-Poisson regression which revealed that an email address's exposure to data breaches increases as it gets used longer. Specifically, the number of breaches associated with an email address increases by 8% per year of use. While 8% might not sound like much, the figure on the right illustrates how this effect builds up over time. So in summary, exposure to data breaches was common, and the longer the email was used, the more likely it was exposed. For the research question 2, where we looked at the participants' perceptions of causes and impacts when affected by data breaches, we found that most participants blamed themselves. 53% reflected on their email practices, such as by quoting the email address's extensive use in account registration. 10% viewed other insecure behaviors as potential causes, such as not being careful with what emails they clicked. And only 14% mentioned external factors, such as the breached company's lax security measures. In answering how a breach has or will impact their lives, participants in more than half of the responses voiced the perception that the breaches would have none or very limited impact despite their most commonly used email address being leaked. Participants who had experienced impacts usually described emotional distress or behavioral changes such as stopping answering phone calls. By contrast, those who haven't experienced impacts usually took the breach less seriously and thought the breach would only affect older accounts with no sensitive information. So in summary, for research question 2, we found that when asked for the cause of being affected, participants mostly blamed themselves and thought that breaches had no impact on their lives. With respect to research question 3 and the participants' awareness of data breaches, we found that participants were unaware of the majority, namely 74% of breaches, and were aware of only 18%. So, in the answer to research question 3, we see that participants were largely unaware of data breaches. And with this, I hand over to my colleague Yixin for the remainder of the talk.
Thank you, Peter, for covering the first half of our talk. I'll start by sharing our findings on participants' emotional responses to data breaches. Participants' likely responses reflected a low concern for the breach overall, as the media was only somewhat concerned. Certain data types stood out as they triggered more concern than others, namely password, physical address, phone number, date of birth, IP address, and name, all of which received more than 50% somewhat concerned or above responses. In response to RQ4, we found that participants' overall concern level remained low, and password, physical address, and phone number were the top 3 data types that triggered the most concern. Regarding participants' behavioral responses to data breaches, participants reported diverse intentions for the 10 actions we provided. Namely, change other accounts' password and change this account's password were more popular than other actions, perhaps because password triggered more concern than other data types. Other actions like filing complaints or taking legal actions were rarely considered, possibly because most leaked data types were non-sensitive records, unlike credit card numbers or government IDs. Our logistic regression identified awareness and concern as key motivators of action. The finding about awareness is expected, since one needs to be aware of the breach first in order to take action. Regarding concern, for a 1-unit increase on a 5-point scale, the odds of having taken action increased by 2.2. This means that future intervention efforts could consider raising concern to encourage the adoption of protective measures. In response to RQ5, we found that changing passwords was more popular than other actions. Prior awareness and higher concern were key motivators of taking action. To recap, in surveying individuals' awareness, perception, and responses to specific breaches that affected them, we found that exposure to breaches increases as an email address gets used for a longer time. Participants were unaware of most breaches displayed to them. Most participants blamed themselves for being affected and thought that the breach would not impact them. And lastly, participants' overall concern level remained low, yet awareness and concern were key motivators of taking action. We now highlight some of our study's technical and policy implications. First, as we found that an email address exposure to breaches inevitably increases as it's used longer. One idea is to promote the adoption of existing tools that help users create unique email aliases. For example, in signing with Apple, users can provide their email address, but they can also choose the Hide My Email feature, which means Apple will create a random email address for the sign-in and forward incoming correspondence to the user's actual email address. As signing with Apple and similar tools are relatively new, more research is needed to understand the motivators and barriers behind adopting such tools. Second, our finding that the majority of breaches were new to participants indicates that current ways of notifying consumers of breaches may not be effective. Rather than traditional letter-based or email notifications, we see the advantage of in situ methods, such as the Firefox Logwise Password Manager featured here, so that users can learn about breaches and take available action in the moment as they visit a breached site or sort out credentials in their password manager. Note that effective notifications likely will not happen without strong policy interventions. We argue that regulators should set stricter requirements for breached organizations regarding when and how to notify consumers. Consumers should be notified not only for high-risk breaches, as what GDPR suggests, but for all breaches, given that the risk of data breaches is hard to define, and the emotional toll are still concrete harms in legal terms. Ideally, the notification can be delivered in multiple channels to further raise awareness and be understandable and usable for everyone. Moreover, notification alone is not enough, and companies should stay involved in helping consumers recover from breaches. Rather than providing free credit or identity monitoring service, which have limited preventative protections, regulators can mandate or encourage companies to offer more creative protection tools, such as email alias generators, as we discussed before, or password managers, both of which can more fundamentally help consumers manage their online presence. This is all for our presentation today. This research is done by Peter Mayer, Yixin Zhou, Florian Schaub, and Adam J. Aviv. Feel free to check out our paper for more details or reach out to any one of us if you have follow-up questions. Thank you for listening.